welcome to the wonderful world of stamping. This is 5 ways in 5 days free crafty workshop hosted by Simon Says Stamp. I'm Yana Smakula, your host for today. I'm excited to bring you 5 unique ways to stamp. All supplies I'm using for these projects are listed and linked in the video description below for your convenience. That being said, these techniques can be used with many different stamps. Dig through your stash and find the sets you like and stamp away. Stamp kissing is a fun and unique technique to add beautiful texture to your solid images or even solid sentiments. For this, you'll need 2 stamps. First, your main image, a solid stamp, and I'm using the pots from the Printmaking Plans stamp set from Simon Says Stamp. These are small but solid images. And second, you'll need another stamp, something with a pattern to add to your first image. The idea is to use the pattern from that second stamp to embellish or to transfer that pattern onto the first one and embellish the first one. The pots are a great example because you can relate this to real life. If you were making a clay pot, for example, you would be able to press some sort of texture into the clay to add design to the exterior of your pot. All of the techniques I'm teaching in this video use a stamping tool such as MISTI, and I highly encourage you to use MISTI or a similar tool because this will help you achieve better results. I'm going to do a 2-step stamping here. First, I stamped my solid image, the pots, in a light color of ink. It can be any color you want. I used Simon's Pawsitively saturated inks for all of the stamping that I'm showing in this video. With the solid shape stamped, I then bring in the second stamp, the one that has a pattern that I want to transfer onto my first image, the pots. This is a cling background stamp. Now, because it is a cling stamp, I removed the black foam pad from my MISTI. I placed the stamp rubber side up inside the MISTI where you would place the paper. So not the regular side up, but the rubber side up. To do the kissing technique, you need to apply the ink onto the stamp you want to pick up the pattern from. I want to pick up the pattern from this background stamp. My pots are not as big as this background stamp, they're much smaller, so I closed the lid of my MISTI with the stamp of the pots attached to the lid to see where they are going to fall on my background stamp. This tells me which area I need to ink. I don't need to ink the entire background stamp as that would just be a waste of ink. So I ink up the area I know I'll use, and here I'm using a darker color of ink. This is color Sweets. I close the lid of my MISTI and I kiss the 2 stamps. This allows me to pick up the ink from the background pattern stamp and transfer it onto my solid pots stamp. Now I remove the background stamp and I set it aside. You can see I have some sort of pattern in ink on my solid stamps now. I just need to transfer that onto the panel where I had stamped the solid pots. So I bring the black foam and my original panel back inside the MISTI. I close the lid and I stamp. I press lightly and I transfer the ink onto the stamped pots. And this is what the kissing technique is. We use one stamp to pick up a pattern from another stamp to enhance our stamping. I tried various stamps, cling background stamps, to do the kissing technique and add texture to my pots. The first stamp I used is called Scalloped Waves from Simon Says Stamp. This one is shamrock background, and I feel like this one the most. It added very cool texture to my pots. And here I used the Spring Blooms background with the surf ink as the base color and the ocean ink as the one for the kissing part. Now here I also attempted to do double stamping for the kissing technique, and I messed it up slightly as the second impression shifted a bit, but I still love the way it turned out. So this is the kissing technique. Works great for solid stamps, regardless of the stamp size. I know you want to see the finished image and the finished cards, but before I show you those, I also want to show you another technique called shaded stamping with solid stamps. When you stamp a solid image, you typically stamp it in one color of ink, and it can look flat because it is what it is. It's just one color of ink. You can, however, add shading and thus interest to your images by using a shaded stamping technique. It's very easy. Here, I have already stamped the pots in a light pink, but I want to add a little bit darker pink at the base of these pots to add interest. And I can do that by partially inking the pots with either the same color of ink for a softer look or a slightly darker ink color for a more visible result. I like to hold my ink pad at an angle. This helps me to ink up just a portion of the stamps. I picked up my MISTI so you can see the process from the side versus from the top to be able to tell how I hold and how I angle the ink pad. You want to apply more ink at the bottom of your pots and have it fade out as much as possible to the top. Once I applied my darker ink onto the stamp, I like to come in with my lighter ink pad and add lighter ink on top. What this does is it helps to blend the two colors of ink to avoid those harsh lines. I stamp it and you can see the pots now look a bit more interesting as I have added shading at the bottom. You can take it one step further and apply the casing technique on top. So see what we're doing here? We're actually combining and layering various techniques, and we can do that to add even more detail to our solid images. I repeated the same steps here and kissed these as well. And you can see the two panels side by side, one with the regular stamping and stamp kissing on top. This is on the right, and one with the shaded stamping and stamp kissing on top. This is on the left. I stamped a bunch of these panels in various colors of ink as I was testing to see what works well, and here's how I finished these pots. I first stamped the outline image in black ink and used that as an alignment guide. This helps a lot when trying to match the layers of the plants. I used various colors of ink to add the second pot layer to these images. In the same way, I used my alignment guide and stamped the plants using lighter and darker green colors. And here are the panels I ended up with. The first one uses shaded stamping and stamp kissing. Second one, just stamp kissing. Third one, shaded stamping and stamp kissing. And the fourth one, just stamp kissing. Now, there is another way to do shaded stamping. You can apply shading after you've stamped your image using a coloring medium, an alcohol marker or a colored pencil, for example. Here, I used my Polychromos pencils from Faber-Castell and added detail and shading to the stamped plants. So you can do it both ways. Shading with ink pads is much easier, but it doesn't always work, especially if you work with small and tiny images. In that case, you can add shading using a colored pencil or marker. Another way would be to add shading onto the stamp using a watercolor marker, for example, and apply shading in that way. You just color a part of the stamp using a watercolor marker, similar to how you would ink it up with an ink pad and stamp. Shaded stamping works great on large solid images, including sentiments. Here, I used 3 shades of green to stamp a sentiment for this card. I have the Here For You sentiment from the Wall Wishes stamp set from Kathy Zielski and a mini MISTI stamping tool. I feel MISTI is a must-have for this technique. I started by inking up the entire stamp using the lightest ink color. Next, I add medium green to the bottom 2/3 of the stamp. And finally, I add my darkest green to the bottom 1/3 of the stamp. I close the lid of my MISTI and I transfer the sentiment and ink onto the panel. Now, I did not blend the ink on the stamp, so I do have rather harsh lines on my sentiment, but I can fix that by layering additional ink on top, and this is where it is very helpful to use the MISTI tool, as I can double and triple stamp with ease. I reapply the medium color and the light color on the stamp, and I make a second impression. Next, I reapply the dark, medium, and light inks onto the stamp, blending them, and I make the third impression. Now, when you go over the darker ink with a lighter ink pad on a stamp, a slight ink transfer might happen, and you might pick up some of that darker ink with your lighter ink pad. But this is so minimal, I never worry about it. I finished this card by trimming the panel to 3.5 by 4 3/4 inches and foam mounting it onto an abstract background. I shared another video recently showing how I create these abstract backgrounds using ink pads. Do check it out if you want to see how I made it. I also added a black pre-printed sub-sentiment and some sequins. Another unique stamping technique is repeat stamping. And the idea here is to take an image, any image, and stamp it repeatedly. This is a brilliant technique, especially for beginner stampers, as this allows you to stretch your supplies. You can take a small image, Stamp it a bunch of times and create a unique, gorgeous background for your card. Because I'm so in awe with the printmaking plans stamp set, I wanted to use the plans for this technique. Once again, I find that MISTI is very helpful when doing this sort of stamping. But unlike the two previous techniques, you don't really have to use the MISTI to be able to do this. You can just as easily do the repeat stamping technique, old school, and just use the clear block. I stamped the plans 4 times, as this is how many times I needed to stamp them to be able to create a background for an A2 card. I like to use the repeat stamping technique to create unique backgrounds for my cards, but you can also use it to make an emphasis on your card. For example, by stamping the same image in a row using one color of ink, and then stamping one of the images in a contrasting color to put it in the spotlight. There are different takes on this technique, but the idea is simple. You take an image and you stamp it repeatedly. I repeated the plans 4 times to make the background for my card. Once I was done, I trimmed it down to the size of an A2 card, and I took about 1/8 of an inch off and added that onto a teal note card to have a bit of the teal show around the edges to tie in with all of the teal stamping I did for the pots. We've been talking a lot about stamping images, but we sort of forgot about sentiments. A stamped sentiment can make a brilliant focal point for your card, and you won't have to add much to it. I ink blended a colorful abstract background for my card using the Slimline Scene Builder stencil. This helped add a pop of color as I planned to stamp a bold black sentiment over it. Next, I stamped the main sentiment in VersaFine ONYX black ink and added a sub-sentiment in light gray. This is in color Smoke from Simon. Big sentiments make fantastic focal points for handmade cards. I often like to build my sentiments using separate pieces to create unique messages for my projects. Here, I stamped 2 parts of the sentiment and added a 3rd part of the sentiment using a pre-printed die cut. And the sentiment makes a fantastic focal point for this project. I trimmed the panel to 4 by 5¼ inches and adhered it onto a yellow card base and then added a few flat white sequins. As an afterthought, I decided I need to add a plan to this card. Can you tell how much I love the printmaking plans stamp set? So I cut out one of the previously stamped plans and I foam mounted it onto my card. With or without the plan, it looks bright, cheerful, and colorful. Okay, we've covered a lot of techniques in this video, but there's one more technique that I want to show you, and this is called mirror stamping. Mirror stamping allows you to create a reflection of the image. This works amazingly well with critter stamps. For example, you have a critter facing left, but you want another critter next to it facing right, but you don't have a critter like that. You can mirror stamp your critter. This technique is amazing when you want to create a scene and have a reflection of something, such as a reflection in the water. For example, you have houses and trees, and then there's a lake in front of them. You can use the mirror technique to create a reflection of these images in the lake. I am more of a bold and graphic kind of card maker, and I wanted to apply this technique to sentiment stamping. I wanted to create a reflection of the sentiment. The mirror technique gives you best results when you use specialty mirror stamping plates or stamps, and these are a solid piece of photopolymer, or simply said, one big stamp surface. It works like offset printing. It will allow you to make a mirror impression from clear, cling, or wood-mounted stamps. You simply stamp the image onto the clear plate, then flip the plate over and press onto the paper to have the mirror image. Simon Says Stamp has several mirror stamps available in their store, and these will give you the best results. Believe it or not, I did not have a mirror stamp in my stash, and the one I ordered hasn't arrived in time for me to create this video, so I looked through my stash for alternatives. The Simon's Sweet Garden background stamp solved my inventory problem, as the back side of this stamp provided a large enough flat surface for the mirror technique. See how big this stamp is? You want to use the reverse side, the flat side, for mirror stamping. Again, specialty mirror stamping plates or stamps work better for mirror stamping, but this or similar can be used if you don't have specialty supplies in your stash. I removed the foam pad from my MISTI tool and I placed the stamp inside the MISTI as I would normally place it when I intend to pick it up with a MISTI lid. The design is facing down, the flat side is facing up. Next, I have my hello stamp and I want to mirror this on my card. I'm first going to create a mirror impression and I will later add the actual image next to it. It's much easier to align the actual image with a mirror impression versus try and align the mirror impression with an actual image. I rotate the stamp 180 degrees to flip it. This will feel counterintuitive, but trust me, this is the way to do it when you want to do a reflection. I place the stamp on my flat surface, on my flat stamp surface, figuring out where I want it. Next, I close the lid of the MISTI to pick it up. Now, the two stamps will get stuck and it will be difficult to separate them. A little bit of force might be needed, and that's okay. There's no need to panic here. Next, I use the color of ink I want the reflection to be stamped in, and I stamp it onto the flat stamp surface as if I'm stamping this onto the paper. I do not press very hard. I touch lightly. If you press too hard, the ink will ooze out of the sides of the stamp and you will end up with a blurry impression. Now I see that I don't have enough ink, so I ink up my stamp again and I repeat. And I repeat as many times as I need to until I feel I have enough ink on the flat stamp surface. Then I carefully place the paper panel, inside the MISTI. The panel goes correct side down. I use the MISTI corner to align the panel and I press carefully to pick up the ink. I use the corner to align the panel in case I need to repeat this to have a good ink coverage on the paper. I lift it up and we have our mirror impression. It isn't perfect, but because we're using a MISTI, we can repeat it. And I do so to double stamp the hello. Now, I say you place the panel correct side down. Here, I'm working on a blank panel, so it doesn't yet have the front or the back. It's blank. Later, I'll show you the same stamping on a panel where I've already stamped some additional images, and you'll see that the panel has to go down the correct size. This is different from when you do your usual regular stamping using the MISTI tool. Next, I clean my stamps using my stamp chamois and a stamp cleaner, and I remove both from the MISTI. I bring back the foam piece, and I place my white panel inside, and I secure it with a magnet. And all that's left to do now is to stamp our main image. Now it is much easier to align the main image over the reflection as we will be stamping it as is. So this was my test panel as I wanted to make sure that my idea would work. I wanted to stamp this sentiment reflection onto one of the plant panels I made earlier. I repeated all of the steps, but this time I used the plants panel under the solid stamp to help me figure out the placement for the reflection. I wanted to make sure the sentiment was somewhat centered on the panel, and I wanted the sentiment to overlap the plants just a little bit. Instead of using black ink, I used teal for the reflection part of the sentiment. I first tested it on a scrap panel. It looked good. And then I proceeded to stamp it onto my main panel. I applied the ink onto the hello stamp. I closed the MISTI and transferred the ink onto the mirror surface. I aligned the panel with the stamped plants in the corner of the MISTI. You can see the plants are facing down. And I pressed it onto the stamp to transfer the ink and receive my mirror image. I repeated this several times to build the ink coverage and intensity on the panel. Using the corner of the MISTI helped to get it perfectly aligned every single time. Although there's always room for error, so I wouldn't re-stamp it too many times to get it absolutely perfect, as we can always mess up. As you can see, my stamping wasn't completely perfect, but it was good enough for me, so I stopped there and went with it. With the reflection done, I placed the foam back inside my MISTI. I added the panel on top. I cleaned my hello stamp and I positioned it on the panel to stamp the main hello. I aligned it over my reflection. I used the black ink, this was VersaFine ONYX black ink, and stamped the main sentiment directly above the reflection. I added a sub-sentiment stamped at a 90-degree angle. I stamped my friend, And then I foam mounted a pre-printed sentiment strips that reads, "Happy to help in any way." I added this panel onto a teal card base and embellished this card with several sequins. So there you have it, 5 unique ways to spice up your stamping. I hope you will give at least one of these techniques a try. Thanks so much for joining us today. Be sure to check out the other videos in the 5 Ways in 5 Days free crafty workshop hosted by Simon Says Stamp.